Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight, the beautiful spring night of the spring formal on campus. My name's Srikanth Reddy. I'm going to go by my full given name so I don't identify too much with the cocktail that's being served tonight, which I had nothing to do with, but I'm going to have to drink one later. And thank you to everyone who's made this literary festival and tonight's reading possible. And I'll list a few of those people, but there are really too many to enumerate here. I want to begin with Starsha Gill, our events and communications coordinator at the university for the creative writing program, who is the one who thought of doing this here. And it feels like a really great way to rethink what we do in our creative writing program, as we also have been talking about thinking about, poetry in new ways with the relaunch of the Phoenix Poets series. So thanks, Starsha. It's really, really great. And thanks to the press. Second only to Starsha Gill in my heart, for partnering with us to relaunch the series and to co-host this literary festival on campus. We'll also be making more announcements in the future about collaborations with the press and the university to come. The Franke Institute for the Humanities at the university is co-sponsoring this literary festival very generously. The program in creative writing, my co-editors in the Phoenix Poets series, who many of you heard read from their poetry and talk about their vision for what can happen with a venture like this. And the students in my fall term course on literary publishing, The Means of Production, who read hundreds of manuscripts collectively and debated them and made me see poetry in new ways. Many of those students had never really studied poetry before. And so I was kind of thinking, well, how's this going to go? But I found my mind changed about poetry every time we went into the classroom. And one thing that we did together this first year of the relaunch was we read over 300 manuscripts of poetry and discussed them with an eye to trying to find among those almost 300 manuscripts, one needle in the haystack that would be the recipient of the 2024 Phoenix Emerging Poet Prize. And there were a lot of books that a lot of people came to care about during our conversations, and then the class just ended before the editors made a selection, and so a lot of you all have been kind of waiting in a little, I don't want to overestimate the importance of this class in your lives, but it was a little bit of a cliffhanger, and so some of you might be curious, who did we select to publish as the second year's recipient of this award? And that poet is Tracy Fouad, F-U-A-D, the author of a manuscript portal that might be familiar to some of you, and we're extremely excited to be publishing Tracy's book in 2024 as the second Phoenix Emerging Poet Book Prize recipient. So Tracy's not here. Usually, this feels weird to announce something, and then she's not here, and she doesn't even know that we're talking about her right now because we just decided to announce it today. But please look out for that really exciting book of poetry. And I'm really pleased today to introduce the winner of our, I don't like to use the word winner, the recipient of the inaugural Phoenix Emerging Poet Prize, Dong Li, whose book is now facing out here and a real thing in the world. Our other inaugural poet, Annelyse Gelman, whose first book with the Phoenix Poets series is a recipient of the James Laughlin Award from the Academy of American Poets. So we did something right when we picked these books. Even other people decided to give them prizes. I'll begin by introducing Dong, and Dong will read for about 20 minutes, and then I'll introduce Annelyse, and Annelyse will read for about 20 minutes, and then they will kind of transition to the table for 15, 20 minutes of questions and answers from you all. And I won't moderate that. We'll just kind of let it be a free for all. An accomplished translator working across multiple transnational vectors, Dong Li has translated Chinese poets like Zhu Zhu and Song Lin into English, English language writers like Forrest Gander, C.D. Wright, and Elliot Weinberger into Chinese, and in a sort of linguistic grand jeté, he's now translating Chinese writers into German and vice versa as well. It's worth noting Li's significant accomplishments as a translator at the outset of this introduction, because The Orange Tree, Li's first book of original poetry in English, works in many ways as a translation of Chinese familial and political historiographies into the aesthetic field of Western poetics. It's also an extraordinarily moving book of poetry that testifies to the imaginative resilience of a searching and innovative literary artist. The Orange Tree may be read in some ways as a chronicle rather than a history, following Hayden White's definition. The chronicle represents historical reality as if real events appeared to human consciousness in the form of unfinished stories. The Orange Tree is a compendium of stories of how the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang, rose to unification before Christ, of how Deng opened China, of how the author's grandmother opened a food stall by the railway station. Stories that collectively constellate into the unfinished story of modern China. Li's brilliance as the writer of this literary chronicle is to make the grammatical past tense of all these stories feel as if they're unfolding in a continuous present, with closure postponed to some field of emergent futures. If this sounds outlandishly ambitious, that's because it is. But the various scales of historical imagination, from the civilizational to the familial, are held in place by the witnessing compassion of the book's literary speaker. Like a deft translator, Li himself is autobiographically invisible, yet everywhere present as the organizing intelligence behind The Orange Tree. The book's title poem beautifully demonstrates Li's self-effacement as an author, and simultaneously his deep imbrication in the historical narrative through its first-person plural opening. In a yellowed family photo, there's an orange tree, leaves burned. The oranges are green, but we are already starting to look alike in the photo. We, as readers, are subtly assimilated into the we who are already starting to look alike in the photo, that serves as a historical source document for this astonishing meditation on family history, collective trauma, and imaginative recovery. The unfathomable violence of political history. In 6 weeks, 300,000 people were tortured, buried, and burned alive in ditches, coexists with the luminous details of Proustian remembrance, the lacquered window opened to the garden of green and red oranges. Li brings a translator's linguistic attentiveness and emotional acuity to the historical narratives of the orange tree in ways that enlarge contemporary American readers' sense of Chinese culture and society, and our senses of ourselves as well. Please join me in welcoming this year's recipient of the inaugural Phoenix Emerging Poet Prize, Dong Li.
Thank you so much. So it's really not about me, but about this baby, the orange tree. And so it's such an honor to be here. And it's also a joy to read from this book. And so the orange tree has been a lonely child, was a lonely child for a long time. And now it has a home. And I think it's it's wonderful to read at home at the University of Chicago Press and at this event, to read at home, for the child to read at home. And so I'll just start. I'll mainly read from the first two sections of the book. And you don't have to know anything about Chinese history. And so let history come to you. Okay, so this is the orange tree. The long dead. The grief wall. The spring autumn, the flight west, the family fire, the slanting wheels, the departing face, the whirling darkness, the wordless light, aviary of water and fire. The Chinese say, woman, water, men, fire. Water and flame, they fight. Wolf, she cries to the great wall. Tide rises, slow. His mind, a fire on the long river, ready to cross. Women were water. When the march was not long, when grief held. Under the rubble of an 800-mile wall, she held his cold bones to her warm body. A lament felled the great wall. Their wedding night was not long ago, a long march away from home. Then he was forced to build the wall. Sent before the night of their union, when spring and autumn clashed in the Middle Kingdom. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, rose to unification before Christ. Walls were rebuilt against northern tribes playing pipa by the prairie bonfire. She drowned herself in the Eastern Sea, her husband buried under the wall, her pipa left by the water. Before dying, the emperor brought his terracotta army under Mount Li. Then the northern tribes broke across the wall. Great-grandparents took flight westward. Before four walls without a roof, before history turns vaguely gray. Only pipa remains to be plugged. Water, the way water floods rice fields in spring, the way rice shots sky high in paddies through spring and autumn. Lao Tzu flew westward on a crane of immortality. Qin Shi Huang burned books to unify people in the first kingdom that lasted. Confucius' followers stayed in cities where they were buried alive in ditches. They chose to live and think. What is the moral when the pillow is empty, when the person is dead? What is the way? The Chinese choose to live. Life passes unto life, name unto name. Death, you have to find out for yourself. Bear witness, eastern waters. The wheels. Time rolls out a scroll of a few strokes. Spring and autumn slant to history. The self advances toward delusion. 10,000 things advance to enlightenment. What will trickle? What will draw through? Traveling in the feathering bluebirds, life departs the face, genealogy begins to pray in the new vernacular, in the aviary of. Maternal great-grandparents have been dead for a long time. Paternal great-grandparents too. Maternal grandparents are long dead. Paternal grandparents died. Grandma, grandpa, you are dead. Parents are dying. Ma, fa, you are dying. Am I dead or dying? Is death the only family? Pluck the peepah, the great wall of grief will fall. Pluck the peepah, the great wall of grief will fall. The yellowed photo, the traveling blood, the ousted grace, the dead winter, the ardent betrayal, the hanging window, the street fight, the wasted wanderer, the burning white, the orange tree. In a yellowed family photo, there is an orange tree, leaves burned. The oranges are green, but we are already starting to look alike in the photo. By the orange tree is grandparents' house. We all once walked over its threshold to pick oranges. The tree was tall, and only men in the family could reach. Uncle, Grandma's only surviving son, was young then. He could not reach. So we took turns to shake the tree. There was always traveling in the family, in our blood. The big orange tree bloomed when grandparents passed away. The house was handed over to Uncle. Next time the oranges turned orange, we would meet again under their shade. We agreed, just like the times when grandparents were alive. Grandpa was born into a general's family in Nanjing. His father was an ardent follower of Sun Yixien. The elder son of the family, Grandpa inherited his father's title. He worked for the nationalist government of Kuomintang, which Sun founded. He also took care of the family orchard garden. In the garden, each generation planted their own orange tree. During festive times, and even in later war times, neighbors were invited. In the garden, they could enjoy the delicacy of the season. Grandpa had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. His youngest brother fell in love with a Japanese lady, and they secretly married. Great-grandpa ousted him from the family. We never had orange parties again. The youngest brother soon got a job as a chauffeur for the Japanese war generals. He started his own family with the lady. He became a trader. In the dead winter of 1937, Grandpa's orange trees were still in their prime. The oranges fell at night, one after another, soft on the ground. The Japanese army invaded the old capital. In 6 weeks, 300,000 people were tortured, buried and burned alive in ditches. The Yangtze River bloomed orange-red. Great-grandpa was able to make some arrangements before the invasion. He gave all to the Communist Party and betrayed Kuomintang. He arranged for Grandpa to leave for Suzhou. On December the 8th, he hanged himself by the window. The lacquered window opened to the garden of green and red oranges. The oranges had their first frost. Before fleeing, Great-grandpa gave Grandma an orange tree plant. He told her to plant it where the soil was rich. When the orange tree was with us, then we will be together. We would have some shade and fruit in the family. Soon, the two younger brothers were shot to death in anticipation of the atrocities to come and revenge for the fugitives. The two sisters were reluctant to leave Nanjing. At a nunnery in the eastern suburb, they shaved their heads. Grandpa, together with Grandma and their first daughter, fled. They walked 45 miles and settled in Rainbow Street 12. The orange plant was finally put in the soil. When the family was still in Nanjing, in the family garden, maternal great-grandparents were having orange parties. Paternal great-grandparents joined the People's Liberation Army on the Long March. 80,000 people went on the march, and 7,000 made it to Yan'an headquarters. Great-grandparents were left unburied on the firm, snowy mountains. 10 years later, Grandpa joined the party and was later transferred to Suzhou. In due season, the orange plant bloomed. Paternal grandpa liked eating oranges. Maternal grandparents held orange parties, just like the parties great-grandparents held in the family garden. They met, and paternal grandpa became a family friend. This was just before the founding of the People's Republic of China. The local Communist Party factions were still fighting for power. Grandpa was wounded in a street fight. He dragged his bleeding legs and elbowed his way to maternal grandparents' house. Grandma had some medical knowledge from her surgeon father. She treated locals for free. Paternal grandpa hid under the orange tree until he could walk again. He was made hero of the party. He protected maternal grandparents' family from execution. He never mentioned their affiliations. Day by day, the orange tree grew taller, but the family never had time to enjoy its fruit or shade. They recited Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. The Cultural Revolution began following 3 years of natural disasters. Mother was 4. She survived famine on orange peels. 38 million people died from hunger. Grandma's first son died of TB. On her shabby medical table, Grandma died a week later from exhaustion. 10 years of Cultural Revolution, Father joined the Red Guards. At school, they tortured his teachers. They traveled across the country to meet other young activists, to propagate Mao's thought. On a train to Beijing, Father brought a basket of bright red oranges. He wanted to see Mao. Tiananmen Tower was flooded with the orange-red faces of the young guards. People wondered and wasted away. They had no time for orange parties. More orange trees were planted after the Cultural Revolution. They were no longer a rare delicacy, and more varieties appeared in the marketplace. After China's opening, we never had time to meet again at Uncle's house. Uncle moved into a modern apartment building, and no one ever picked oranges again. Still, the orange tree bore fruit. Winter comes and goes. Oranges fall and grow. The dead and the living travel through the house, past the shade of the old orange tree. Its white flowers bloom and wilt. Then the oranges turn red. Every year, the orange tree turns red. Grandparents never ate any oranges. Last year, the orange tree suffered from warm weather. All its leaves were burned white. Event. Imagine the smell of kudzu. Imagine that kudzu has a smell, myopic edge of night. Imagine the impression of an object. Imagine that object has an impression. Swollen hands slowly over belly. Imagine the dream of birth. Imagine that birth is dream like insides. Imagine the kick of a rib, a scent of rubber. Just whistle. Bell tolls. She crosses bridge from south to north. At a candy factory, she was assigned a job, gulping down half a pound a day. Nearby Taihu Lake freezes and joins Yangtze. She crosses bridge from city to temple. Orange tree flowers in spring. Women pick tea in mist. She crosses bridge from garden to town. Lotus riots in pond. Pipa plucked lantern riddles from mouth to mouth. She crosses bridge from boat, 20 moons under. Tea olives run rampant in garden. School children turn in circles. She crosses bridge from Blue Mountain to Green River, opening a window, knitting a sweater by an orange lamp. She crosses bridge from Longing River to Grief Lake. She has been dead for a long time. When you die, I will be a night cloud. When you die, river flood in spring. When you die, I would shine down bluebirds. When you die, fire on distant islands. When you die, I will be your rice field, she said. Death. Drown yourself. Thank you.
There was no other world to bring a child into, writes Annelyse Gelman in her dreamlike and dystopian epic Vexations. I don't know of any other mother-daughter adventures in poetic narrative form. The fictional premise of Vexations is, in and of itself, a contribution to contemporary women's literature, as if Gertrude Stein were to rewrite Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road. Alice Notley's Descent of Alette and Bernadette Mayer's Midwinter Day might be precursors of Gelman's feminist project. Only her work is more deeply inward in its intimacies and more open to interpretive horizons in its post-structuralist world-making. The central drama of Vexations might be seen as a mother's attempt to safeguard her daughter's interiority in a world that would collapse the individual into the collective. The ceiling is too close, said daughter. It's not touching you, I said. But the ceiling is touching the air, said daughter. And the air is touching me, said daughter. The air is coming inside me, said daughter. The ceiling is coming inside me, said daughter. Inside and outside, mother and daughter, care and precarity, embodiment and environment. Vexations narrates the journey of a mother and her daughter through a speculative world that seems utterly contemporary and at the same time indexical of alternative, unsettling futures. A daughter is born. A specialist is consulted. A diagnosis of persistent indiscriminate receptivity is made. War breaks out. I looked at videos with wires attached to my head. The narrator's daughter must wear the prescribed sensory deprivation suit for the journey. The walls of a hospital room is painted black. It's all utterly strange and very close to home. An extraordinarily literate and experimental work of art, wildly original even as it enters into an intense historical conversation with various aesthetic traditions. Vexations bridges long-form narrative with the miniaturist's precision of lyric poetry. The poetic beauty and narrative drive of Vexations finds closure at the story's conclusion in an Ovidian transformation that reinscribes Gelman's feminist narrative within a long historical tradition of writing women's bodies into new forms. Two butterflies flitted in the folds between her legs. A smear of pollen stained her gold. She writhed like dew comes on the grass. Rain came on the lake. Lorem ipsum dolor in the shade. She wrapped her fists in roots. She flowered in its mouth. She sighed. She wilted. She lay down. Lorem ipsum dolor, as any editor will know, is a placeholder text used in publishing and graphic design to fill and hold a space for something else to come. It seems a fitting place for this work's protagonist to lay herself down. Please join me in welcoming Annelyse Gelman, recipient of the 2022 James Laughlin Award from the Academy of American Poets, to the University of Chicago.
Hello, thank you for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to all of you for being here. This is incredibly special. I'm going to read from Vexations just from the beginning, and I will then skip to the end and read the last few pages as well. Even the grass was coming up positive, souls beating little match tips of blood. A reticular glitch made me saccade like crazy. Clouds like anemones, electric fortresses. A dandelion fluff might fly in your mouth as you ate a hamburger, the last hamburger. That was the year the hurricanes began. I hardly swelled, but felt her features forming. There were airs, waters, places, daughters. I pressed my eyes dry like flowers in book. A tree couldn't move without tearing its roots. There was no other world to bring a child into. Crowds coagulated to watch falling bodies. Daughter depicted them on my uterine walls. We were firm believers in teleology. At first, night crews came like sexton beetles, men with bird masks and wheelbarrows. After a while, there were too many to clean up. Just the ginkgos, a parent might say, regarding the smell. Sometimes a crater held the imprint of a face. The dominant metaphor for the brain was the computer. Subterranean romance, romance of alterity. Who notices the horse becomes the horse, went the saying. I was terrified, of course. I had noticed the mane. I lay down in the flower bed. Fresh in the dirt, she pushed out of me. They cut her in cold water from a rubber hose. Red daughter, red birth. The timbre of an infant's cry foreshadowed its destiny. If there is no pain, you may not be injured, went the saying. Or you may have severed the nerve. It was around that time I started taking the pills. The jingle went, elsewhere, elsewhere. That was the only lyric. They made my skin glossy, like it was about to cry. The body became basically a repository of data. A craving was fungible. You could want pretty much anything. A body was fungible. You could be pretty much anyone. Moths, lots, swarmed the lighthouse lamps. Ships crashed into cliffs, one after another. Elements emerged between our legs like coiled appendages of jellyfish. It was around that time I started taking the pills. Cultivars rolled out each season like new hemlines. I carried the procedures within me, dormant like viruses. The environment updated itself at regular intervals. Sometimes a new species of tree frog, sometimes a lethal infection. People played chess across unfathomable expanses. Studies said fetuses preferred wasps to orchids. Exquisitely dependent, a scientist might say, regarding a spider web. We lost everything, a clown might say, regarding the quake. A person might pay thousands to utter the word dapple. Thousands more to say dapple in front of another person. We crawled out of the seas and smuggled their salts inside each of our cells, each of our portable oceans. Everyone was a labor theorist. No one was a laborer. It was quaint, crass even, to disturb the air with sound waves. Creamy, like a library, someone wrote, regarding madness. Creamy, like certain roses, regarding a woman's cheeks. Creamy bursts, regarding flares dropped from choppers. Creamy, a prayer between two flights. Creamy, the inner surface of one thigh. We didn't know what to do with our garbage. Situations were generally regarded with suspicion. Every extinction was a planned obsolescence. Wretched, a professor might say, regarding the culture. It was forbidden to cause a situation to occur. As for commodities, half the toothpaste was poison. man-made lakes and their too accurate colors. A bark beetle inscribed an elm illegibly. Opaque bodies transparentized where they touched. Soft pop of grubs disclosing their imperiled parts. A tender-tongued admirer espied an especially attractive shrub with which to munch away the afternoon. Sometimes we felt sick from eating too much food. Imagining the future was one wholesome hobby. If you couldn't imagine, you could just go by rote. It was impossible to tell the difference. A person's eyes didn't really unfocus when they had a picture in their mind, not like in the novels. Besides, we were not communicating so much as auditioning sentences for each other. With devout fervor, we humiliated one another. A person might pay thousands to be made chaste again. Celebrate, a counselor might say, regarding productivity. People lay in alcoves with their faces to the concrete in the overgrown parking lot of a reputation laundering firm. The jingle went, "Elsewhere, elsewhere." I sang it in my sleep. In front of the police chief's house, a live oak cracked the sidewalk like creme brulee. Beneath the paving stones, there was not a beach. There were only life-sustaining elements. We would move through life quickly and never get hurt, like a hand brushed through a lit wick, unburnt. Once a month, they took down the missing person posters, pornography of street lamps stripped even of staples. It was difficult back then to articulate a thought, meaning and negligee for words to slip out of, denuded like a peeled apple, a situation. It's difficult now to explain how difficult it was. An elevator door might cut off an interrupting arm, flopped there on the linoleum like a dying carp. Colony collapse, a lover might say. Your last lover, enthusiastically rimming your ear hole. We felt we were at the beginning of something. We already essentially felt we were already essentially doomed. I pet her behind the ears, like a little rabbit. She looked at a word until she could read it. Daughter crawled under the credenza after the dog, the pair of them sniffing out something I couldn't share in. Burrowed in blankets at the bottom of the bed, her shoulder blades warm against my feet. A human heart might spontaneously dissect, or hoard your blood in its dark bunker. Nurses tested the wounded for the apology reflex. The reservoir gave up its annual protest. In the town square, painters tore out the mane with their teeth. Citizens stood by to learn the song of the crying horse. It was around that time I started taking the pills. The jingle went, "Elsewhere, elsewhere." I sang it in my bathrobe, touching a serrated edge to a substantial loaf. Colorful smoke rose from the mouth of an Erlenmeyer flask. Daughter in the school play, hoisted to the ceiling. To move the angel, they tied a rope around its neck. I went to a bright mall with a fire in its center. The ceiling was made of thick glass, magnifying glass, concentrating sunlight into the center of the fire. Over the PA, someone announced a sale on underwear. Photons were bouncing off my face, lost forever. Precarity made me swoon, perfectly breathtaking. Over the PA, someone recited a list of integers, the meaning of which was not intelligible to me. 25, 84, 41, 81. I fell absolutely in love with the voice, my elsewhere. I felt sure that if the numbers concluded, I would die. The mall twinkled with a promising aura of possibility. The voice stopped, and I did not die, ergo I was not in love. We purchased equipment for sleeping safely outdoors. We stored this equipment carefully until it was garbage. Newscasters invented new verbs to accommodate the news. Over the PA, someone announced that the mall was closing. People came up to me and said, "Did you hear?" People came up to me and said, "What mall?" Sitting in silence aroused the neighbors. Minute exchanges of power were a universal currency. An incarcerated man asked for a photograph of the sun. I found the eggs and set a trap in the pantry. We were cloven. We equipped ourselves with debt. We wrote contracts with the rivers and signed them. The word impending no longer prefaced collapse. The earth smelled like shit from runoff and rainlessness. Like my predecessors, I suffered from a crisis of attention. Speculate meant to imagine, but also to gamble. We were hopeless with risk, helpless, wrapped. I put the oval on the back of my tongue. Colonies popped out of empire like mushrooms. Coral reefs thinned out their amenities. The entire pluck could be removed en masse for complete evaluation. Daughter landed wrong at the bottom of a slide. The weight of the ice melt slowly tilted the earth. As for the starry crown, we didn't know what to do with it. We volunteered to make phone calls to lonely people. A shy mimosa cringed when you touched it. A compound connected with a receptor and a smell occurred. Daughter stared at her plate. She wouldn't eat until I told her exactly how much yellow the yolk contained. In the rainforest, each animal occupied its verticality. I got an occurrence for talking wrong to a stranger. I distracted daughter while they arrested my neighbor. A man got put on chain and transferred south. A mother taught her daughter where to put her mouth. Beginners in a language all learned the same phrases. You could still drink straight from the ground in places. It was around that time I was accused of faking it. There was text everywhere, lush orchestral text, a procession of violent images culminating in a fact. Like my predecessors, I suffered from a crisis of authenticity. Elsewhere, I would have defended it with my life, reaching for comfort, like a leaf toward light. Your song is a privilege, not a right, went the saying. Who sings least lovely in the field shall have it revoked. Head of horse, waving in wind, positively fluttering. We pledged allegiance to the last fascist Winnie. Still we gnawed the sweetest bits of all the sweetest trees. Ashes in the atmosphere made sunsets last for weeks. One day, daughter sliced her palm open on the gate in the backyard where the possum wouldn't stop hissing. We hit it with a hockey stick, but it wouldn't budge. Its tail was thick and pale like the forearm of a man we punish by putting him in a cell where he can't empathize with anyone. We hit him with a hockey stick, but he won't budge. I jiggled the faucet and out sputtered the muck. The cut was wide but not deep, praise be. A toy train passed behind a toy mountain and disappeared. Have you ever watched a child develop solitude? Doubt comes over her like a sleeper wave on a gorgeous day. The blood was common poppy red, the grass chroma key green. Waves of action potentials crashed into my brain. Daughter flinched when I daubed the necessary stuff. Beneath our feet, the whole entire world passed, bit by bit, through the bodies of the earthworms. "Mama," she said, as I wrapped her bandage, "do you feel how much it hurts?" I had the feeling I should start collecting something. I had the feeling toxins were accumulating in my body. I had the feeling my personal history was indistinguishable from toxicity. Smog spawned dark murmurations over suburbs. Events slid into each other, marvelously promiscuous. Pronouns sludged through me, entirely inadequate. Sometimes daughter tried to write with my hand. A subdivided insect ate one bit of each available plant with its diffuse body, spreading like an oil spill over the roses, a seed dispersed by exploding, and the mountains rose, purpled to the hilt. All of a sudden is how fish occupied the land. Over the PA, someone said, "Close down the gallery." The surgeons began by inflicting a wound and aimed a bright light into her darkness. Over the PA, someone said, "Retractor, please." I waited in cold blood in the room we used for meetings. They fed us vanilla cupcakes with chocolate frosting. Elsewhere, we were living to completion. "A spoken word is not a sparrow," went the saying. The sutures would heal over, leaving barely a scar where the old reality had been, like a long-forgotten fever. "To each his own purpose," said the man in the pony mask. "I believe it," we all said back. You could put tears on a slide and examine them for a reason. You could breathe headfirst in the ice at the base of a pine. You could refuse all ideology, which was an ideology. We attended to the climate the way a fly attends to the spider in whose web it's caught. A father taught his son where to put his apologies. A single encounter could contaminate you for life. People wanted to watch videos of people struggling, e.g., a boy pretending to catch and then eat a salmon. Another boy comes along and steals the salmon, etc. The surgeons pulled at the flap like a little door. An actor held their breath to be dead. The image was not available in my territory. I sat in the ward for hours but couldn't imagine anything. All speech was a form of advertisement. All observation was a form of confession. To reveal the wires, they opened daughter's wrists. There were only vines. What quality of life was worth preserving? The dominant metaphor for thought was virality. An idea was something to which one might be exposed and realigned in an instant, like shocked quartz. The hierarchy of sentience was tacitly unimpeachable. Under the asphalt, the treacherous goo. On the cliff, people stopped talking about the cliff. That was the funny thing about the cliff. One by one, we watched the bodies dangle and fall. When a body survived, that was a miracle. When a miracle survived, it became an individual. But an individual could not survive. What would happen to me would not hurt, I felt sure. What hurt was to know exactly what would happen. I followed the crowd back to the cliff, and joyously, rapturously, I jostled for my turn. And when the valley was full before I could jump, guilt curdled through me, curled through me. There were other valleys, to be sure, other daughters I could recognize but couldn't recollect. Subjunctive moods, birthday parties, the future perfect. "Happiness is a choice," said the man in the pony mask. Fate sat on your knee like a child and told you what it wanted. As for wanting, we didn't know what to do with it. Capacious horse, ludicrous horse, undulant horse. You could drive to the dollar store and buy a packet of butternut squash seeds. They weren't even proprietary. My brain generated opinions in response to things. It had nothing to do with me. As for agency, half the bullets were spent. There were no causes anymore. There were only origins. In the morning, I wrung out my dreams into a basin, swirled like oil slicks in a gas station parking lot puddle. I wiped the ointment onto daughter's back, moving my hands in a figure eight. I washed dishes below a running faucet, and the water went away. She walked into the meadow. I watched her through the window, and I watched her name the buttercup's yellows. At the core of the planet, a terrible fire burned. She cowered in the grass, she lipped the pistils. The scent of growth was the scent of decay. On the planet's surface, her slender fingers clawed the clay. Their sharp and shiny leaves were slim as wrists. She ran her tongue along the stamen to the tip. A stem bent gently and slid inside, thin and thornless. The blossom made her water, she winked and dripped. Sky covered earth like a poultice. Petals licked at her like flames, exchanging softnesses. Daughter arched her back. The roots wrapped her fists like vines on the pillars of oracles' temples. As a ripple inflects a pond, as two clouds become one, as blood in the milk makes the calf cry, as a spider's silk tautens to taste the fly. Two butterflies flitted in her folds. A smear of pollen stained her gold. She writhed. Like dew comes on the grass, rain came on the lake. Lorem ipsum dolor in the shade. She wrapped her fists in roots. She flowered in its mouth. She sighed. She wilted. She lay down. Thank you.
Thank you, Annelyse. Thank you, Dong. We have a little time for some questions for the poets. I'll rejoin the audience, but maybe kick it off, the conversation with a question to you both. I mean, I see something new in your work every time I open the books again and hear you read from it. But one thing I kept thinking about as I was hearing you both together was that your work could be described as narrative, and at the same time, by kind of the opposite, in a way, as ambient. And I'm wondering if you could talk about kind of what those words or ways of thinking about poetry might mean to you as writers, and like callers into a radio show. I'll take my answer off the air.
Yeah, this is a big question at the heart of Vexations, and my original intent, which I had to state very clearly because I wrote an application for a residency where I wrote the manuscript, and so I had to have a whole project proposal. The idea was to make an ambient poem, so this like purely ambient, malleable text. I think at one point I thought the entire thing could just be scrambled and you would be able to read it in any order, or you would walk into a room where the poem is installed and it would just be sort of perpetually playing like drone music. And what I discovered once I really started writing the book was that I simply wasn't invested in the project, and I think I'm always thinking about my reader when I'm making something, and I just thought that something that sort of was so textureless that it could become arbitrarily long or arbitrarily short, and that had nothing to really hold the reader's hand and guide the attention. I wasn't satisfied, and so for me, narrative crept into the book kind of against my wishes, and it was quite confusing for a number of weeks, and then once I discovered Daughter, the book started to come together.
For me, I think the prose and the lyric, they're like siblings. They don't get along during the day, but they dream of each other at night. That's sort of my take of the prose and the lyric. And I think the narrative has a lot of, I like sort of that sort of resistance. You know, during the day they sort of fight with each other, but then they get along. So I like that sort of movement between prose and lyric. And I think, you know, the Orange Tree just, you know, lines in lines and just fragments with a full stop. And I sort of like that because I feel like a sentence or a line that just, you know, it could be in itself was sort of a poem, a lyric. And I like that, people sort of think, okay, this is prose, but it actually has a lot of lyrical energy, but it has sort of this friendliness that you don't, usually get from, classical lyric poetry. So I sort of like that, yeah.
Thank you so much for these wonderful readings, gorgeous readings. In some ways, the two readings are very related, and in some ways they're a departure from one another. Dong, your readings seem to me really invested in ancestry in the past, and Annelyse, your readings seem to me really invested in progeny in the future. Right? But both are about lineages in some way or another. I wonder if you could reflect with one another, talk to one another about lineages and poetry, and maybe the poetic line.
Well, I would just, get off the question. Any language has a history, and any language has a lineage, and languages are sort of also like siblings, and the lyric also has a lineage. But the past is never past, and the lineage is, unfurling into the future. And that's how you sort of, go back to the past, because you want to, to see the whole lineage. When you step back, you're looking at the past, the present, and the future, and that's where you stand. And I think where you stand in language, it's a place that's sort of, that you create that distance. A book is sort of like kind of, a frame. You have a frame. The book is sort of a frame, a window onto, the future of that language, but also you can look the other way. That's sort of the past of that language. And I feel like, or for me, it's like poems or, good fiction. I think they're all speaking the language of languages. And the language of language, I mean, that is sort of the lyric for me. And it has a past, but that past is not, past yet.
I think for me, when I think about lineage and vexations, I think about this sort of desire to put all of my life experience into the book. I published my first book a decade ago when I was 21, and it's very friendly and chatty and more narrow in its scope. It's really about the social, and I think for Vexations, I was drawing on a huge variety of different disciplines, a huge variety of different kinds of texts, different poets, different scientists, different researchers, historians, and so I think my desire was to embed these lineages in the text of the poem in a way that would accomplish something that's very important to me as somebody who sort of started out in spoken word, performing for audiences, engaging their reactions, and someone who really wants to use poetry as a form of communication, which is that upon the first read or upon the first listen, you will be able to get a lot out of the text, and then as you dig deeper and deeper into it and read multiple times or Google certain lines, you will start to uncover these lineages. So the phrase, the whole pluck could be removed en masse for complete evaluation, for example, it comes very directly from a guide to equine field necropsy that I was reading. So if you want to dissect a horse, but you don't have your tool shed nearby, then that's an instruction on how to do that. There are subtler and also more overt ways of bringing in that lineage, and then, of course, merging my own voice with them as a way of sort of physically enacting what Chiku was talking about with this increasingly blurred line between the interior and the exterior, or the individual and the collective, or the self and the society.
I just want to add one thing. I think lineage is for us to access, these ancestors, these ghosts, when your mind grabs onto them and their stories and their fragments, their traces, you're with them, they're present with you. And I feel they give really lineage, when you're thinking about tracing lineage, really they are actually the lineages providing you access to them, to these ancestors, to these ghosts.
Thanks. Yeah, both of your pieces are so ambitious in their landscape building in different ways, and I'm just kind of curious about your research processes and how you decided which texts to engage with and what your shadow texts were in the development of your projects.
So I wrote Vexations pretty quickly over the course of 3 months. And so as far as texts, I was fairly limited to the texts that I had prior experience with and the texts that happened to be in the library of this foundation in Switzerland where I was working. But I also had a lot of research that, in the decades since my first book, I felt I hadn't completely excavated in the way that I'd wanted to, and in a way that an individual poem would allow. So a lot of that came out in this longer text. I think psychology research is a big part of that. That's what I studied in college, and I always thought that I would go on to get a PhD and be a research scientist, but instead I fell in love and went to the desert and became a poet. That was very much on my mind while I was writing this, everything from these sort of research into cognitive psychology, understanding how attention works and how memory works, effects like primacy and recency, right, which determine if you receive a large amount of text at once, what are you going to actually attend to and what are you going to remember afterwards? Or things like chunking, right? Like how long can something be before you can no longer hold it in memory? Or even things like the word saccade in the first stanza, like that was there from the very moment that I started the book. And a saccade is this, if you look carefully at somebody's eyes, you'll see that they really they make these rapid, abrupt jumps all of the time from object to object. It's not a smooth glide. And so that jumping effect, well, I learned about that studying psychology and looking at eye tracking experiments. It then became a way to approach poetics where you would have these kind of cinematic cuts that serve as saccades for the eye and also for the attention. I have no idea if I answered your question.
I started the book a long time ago. So the title poem, The Orange Tree, was a speech that I made at a college in the middle of nowhere, Deep Springs College, in the desert. And so I was trying, I was missing my mother. So I heard, the voice of my mother sort of coming on these clouds and, and also in the night sky, I was sort of thinking about my mother because communication was really bad. The phone lines wouldn't work and the internet wouldn't work. So, so these feelings, I think, they sort of, they spring in me. And also, I fell in love with the American English language. I think it's some sort of the best language for poetry because it's openness, just like the desert, and its flexibility. You can just mold it the way you like. If you're being consistent, artistic about it, then people will accept that, which is not the case with most languages, I believe. And so I was trying to learn, really to get into American English, get into the music and the sound of that language. And I was in the desert. It was easier to get that sound when you're actually in the desert and you hear those echoes and stuff. And so I was hearing my mother in the desert, and I started to write the pieces. And when the phone lines worked, I would call my mother on the phone and thinking, tell me a story. Most of my family members back in China, they're mostly illiterate, so they're not, but the women are talkers. So I would listen to, especially my mother and the women, and thinking, okay, if I can transport that voice onto the page, then they could be my poets, right? They would be writing the poem through me. I become their vessel, and also that really fits. That really fit at the time because I was learning American English. I thought, well, I can transport that into American English. So my mother I would have my mother's company as I was doing this. So I thought that was sort of, it's really, love is behind everything. It's sort of the unconditional love of my mother and her sacrifices. I think that was sort of the engine, the whole engine behind the book. And then my grandfather died, and then my parents withheld the information like most Chinese parents would do, and for more than a year, and that was sort of that actually helped the whole mess to erupt. But finding a shape, I think it's easy. To shape the poems, I think it's easy. Everybody has a shape. Every tree has a shape. You just have to look at it. You look at it long enough, and the shape comes to you. And I think that's what I do with the materials that I get from my mother. Just seeing these shapes and these materials, you look at them, and then they sort of, you play with it. And then they sort of slowly come into focus, and then you put them into a frame, and then position these little things into the frame. But at the end of the day, you want to throw out the frame. You want, your readers or to see the whole landscape. And I think that's how that started. So that's a great question about landscape. It's all about landscape. Yeah.
Thank you, Doug and Annelyse. I think there are many more questions, but let's have them with wine and drinks and food. And thank you both. Thank you for sharing your work with us. It's